This video was brought to you by Nebula. Over the weekend, Europeans across the continent will go to the polls to vote in the EU Parliament elections. And the big story is the predicted electoral success of the so-called far right. Polls ahead of the EU election show that the far-right parties are surging across Europe. And interestingly, young voters have emerged as a key demographic driving their success. In Germany, for instance, a recent survey found that 22% of Germans aged 14 to 29 backed the AfD, up from 12% in 2023, making them the most popular party in that age bracket. It's not just Germany either. Other polling suggests young people seem surprisingly keen on far-right parties in places like France, Portugal, and the Netherlands, to name just a few. This has come as a bit of a shock to political commentators, given that young people are usually more left-wing than their older generations. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at where young Europeans have shifted to the right, how this compares to countries like the US and UK, and why this might be. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Let's start by taking a look at where young Europeans are moving right. As we mentioned in the intro, Germany's neighbour France has also shown signs of this phenomenon too. In France, 36% of 18 to 24-year-olds and 39% of 25 to 34-year-olds back Marine Le Pen's national rally, compared to just 29% of 65-year-olds. In Portugal, 25% of 18 to 34-year-olds support the newly supported anti-establishment right-wing Chega party, which translates in English to enough, compared to just 18% of the general population. While in the Netherlands, 31% of 18 to 24-year-olds support Geert Wilders' Freedom Party, or PVV, compared to 30% of 25 to 44-year-olds and 29% of pensioners. It's a similar story in Belgium too, where the anti-immigrant and separatist Flemish Interest Party has become remarkably popular with young people, although in Belgium, the far right is also very much concentrated in young men. A national poll ahead of the regional, national, and EU elections in June found that a 32% plurality of Gen Z men would vote for the Flemish Interest, and 24% would vote for another right-wing party, the New Flemish Alliance. While the most popular party with Gen Z women, on the other hand, are the Greens and Forward, the successor to the Belgian Socialist Party. Flemish Interest and New Flemish Alliance are actually the least popular parties when it comes to Gen Z women. It's actually a similar story in Germany, with the AfD enjoying a much broader support among young men than young women, who are more enthusiastic backers of the Greens. Then there's also Finland, where the anti-immigration right-wing Finns party placed second in Finland's 2023 general election, with 20% of the vote. And the Finns were actually the most popular party in all age groups other than voters older than 65, who remained loyal to the centrist parties, but they're especially popular with young men. The Finns and the centre-right National Coalition were also by far the most popular parties with young men, while the centre-left Social Democrats and Greens were the most popular with young women. Now, not only is this a violation of the age-old political rule that young people are more left-wing than their elders, but it's also difficult to square with what's happening in Anglophone countries like the UK, US, and even Australia, where young people are apparently getting even more left-wing. In the US and UK, for example, millennials are actually getting more left-wing as time goes on. For instance, ahead of the July general elections in the UK, YouGov has given Labour a 40-point lead among voters aged 25 to 49, and a 43-point lead among voters aged 18 to 24. Young Australians also deserted Scott Morrison's coalition party in the 2022 election in a similar way. So what's actually going on here? Well, there are sort of three separate phenomena that all need explaining. Firstly, the rightward shift among young Europeans. Secondly, the gender divide within that shift. And thirdly, the Euro-Anglo divergence. Now, we've done full videos on both the gender divide and the Euro-Anglo divide elsewhere, so you can go and watch those if you want to know more. But the TLDR is that the gender divide probably has something to do with the growing education gap between men and women, the declining salience of religion as an indicator for women's voting preferences, and the polarizing effect of certain culture war issues. Meanwhile, the Euro-Anglo divide probably has something to do with the fact that young Europeans are actually more right-wing than Americans and Brits on cultural issues, like immigration and welfare. Aside from these cultural issues though, Europe's pluralistic electoral systems are also an important factor here. For context, in part because they're representative rather than majoritarian, Europe's political systems are just more pluralistic than the US and UK. In other words, Europeans usually have multiple parties to choose from, whereas in the US and UK, there are only really two options. In Europe, new parties pop up all the time, and a current trend shows that young voters across Europe are veering towards newer parties, which includes right-wing platforms, such as Portugal's Chega, established in 2019. There's also the fact that the right-wing parties that young Europeans like usually have an anti-establishment bent. So it might just be that young people don't think the current system is working for them, so instead they vote for the most anti-establishment party out there. But in the UK and US, there's not really a viable anti-establishment party, so young Brits and Americans just have to settle for Labour or the Democrats. This might also explain the general shift towards the far right among young Europeans as well. In other words, it might be that young Europeans are voting for so-called far-right parties, not because they're right-wing, but because they're anti-establishment, and young voters have no allegiance to establishment parties. This is what the so-called far-right often claim. They're not far-right so much as anti-establishment, and they've only been pejoratively labelled far-right by the establishment to discredit their politics. To be clear, we're not endorsing these claims, but it could plausibly be this sort of thinking that motivates young Europeans to vote for more radical parties. This trend might also be exacerbated by the rise of social media. Young Europeans are more likely than ever to get their news from social media sources like TikTok, which generally biases towards newer, fringe, and therefore more anti-establishment parties than the mainstream centrist parties. Both because at least until recently, older established parties are more likely to rely on mainstream media, and because social media is just cheaper for these newer parties. So, those are a handful of tentative explanations for why young Europeans look set to vote for the more radical right at this weekend's European elections. That's clearly not an exhaustive list of reasons, and there will be country-specific factors at play too. So let us know if there's anything you think we've missed or should have included, and subscribe to stay up to date with our coverage of both this weekend's European elections and their aftermath. That's not the end of the story though, and if you want to continue more, then you should check out Nebula News. Nebula News is our joint venture with Nebula, where the TLDR team curates a selection of videos that matter most in the world right now. No more feeling out of touch or not knowing what to say at events. On Nebula News, we guide you through the news that matters most, using videos from a huge variety of creators, helping you to find stories and better avoid burning out. It's not just curated news content brought to you by us though. Nebula also features loads of exclusive original content. That's things like Real Life Law's brand new series War Room, which every month runs you through a whole load of ongoing conflicts to keep you in the loop. You can also watch every TLDR video on Nebula ad-free and in many instances before they land on YouTube. Now, if you're already subscribed to Nebula, then you can check out the new Nebula News section at nebula.tv/news. And be sure to bookmark it or save that link so you can use it as your TLDR-ified news homepage. If you're not a member already, then you can click the link in the description to sign up now. And if you do, you'll get 40% off an annual plan by using that link. That's less than £2 a month. Plus, Nebula will know that you came from us, which really helps us out.